I quit my job as a mortician a few years ago, and everyone who used to work with me back then is dead now. So I figure it's finally safe to tell you what actually happens in a funeral home after the viewing room lights go out. Before I get into the night that changed everything, I need to explain how I ended up in this profession at all. My grandfather, Walter, was found in his house 2 days after he died. Nobody had heard from him, and when my mother finally went to check on him, she found him in his armchair, gone. He'd left very specific instructions for his funeral. No embalming. He always said it felt unnatural, like keeping a puppet propped up after the show was over. He wanted a home viewing in his own living room, surrounded by the family instead of some stranger's funeral parlor. So that's what we did. The house filled with flowers to cover the smell, and the whole family gathered around his casket to say goodbye. My aunt was the one who screamed first. When we all turned toward the casket, Walter was sitting up. His eyes were open, but they weren't looking at any of us. Not really. They were fixed on something none of us could see. He didn't speak. He didn't seem to recognize anyone. The paramedics who came called it Lazarus syndrome, some rare cardiac fluke that made a body seem to revive after clinical death. It was the only explanation anyone offered us, and it was the only one that made sense at the time. Walter lived another 11 days after that. He ate, he slept. Sometimes he smiled at nothing in particular. He never spoke another word, and he never again looked like the man who raised my mother. When he died the second time, she had him embalmed, ignoring his wishes completely. Nobody in the family joked about it, but I remember the silence in the room when the funeral home confirmed there'd be no home viewing this time. That was the beginning of my obsession with what happens to a body after death, and eventually what led me to mortuary school. I graduated with my degree and landed an internship at a funeral home a few towns over, run by a man named Harlan Voss. I was ambitious and a little arrogant about it. Mortuary science has one of the worst dropout rates of any profession, and I remember thinking I was better than the people who quit in their first month, the ones who couldn't stomach a dead body being more than a piece of meat. I'd learn later that they were the smart ones. There were 5 of us in that first internship cohort. Voss gave us the hardest cases early, deliberately, to weed out anyone who wasn't built for it. I nearly walked out myself after reconstructing the face of a child who'd been in a car accident, but her mother thanked us afterward for letting her see her daughter's face one more time, whole. And that kept me in the room. By the end of the first year, only 2 of us were left, me and a woman named Priya. Voss called us both into his office near the end of our first year. "Congratulations on completing your internship," he said, though his tone didn't match the words at all. "Thank you," Priya and I said, almost in unison. He didn't look up from the paperwork on his desk. Outside his office, I could hear the wheels of a gurney rolling down the hall, another body headed for the coolers. I wanted out of that office more than I'd wanted out of anywhere in my life, and I didn't yet understand why. "I need both of you to stay overnight tonight," Voss said, sliding papers across the desk. Sign these. Tonight you'll understand exactly why this job has the turnover it does." The paperwork was dense with legal language about confidentiality, about liability, about things I didn't fully understand at the time. Whatever was happening tonight, we weren't allowed to discuss it with anyone outside the building. Priya made coffee while we waited, half out of habit, half to steady her nerves. What could possibly require this much paperwork? She asked. "No idea," I said, trying to make light of it. "Pretty sure I just signed away my soul." "Did you still have one to give?" She laughed, though it didn't quite reach her eyes. When we returned to the prep room, Voss was standing beside 4 bodies, laid out and ready. Our usual charts and instruments were missing. He looked at the paperwork in his hands, then back at us, his expression darkening when he realized neither of us had backed out. "Last chance," he said. "There's no shame in walking away right now." "I'm staying," I said, My voice steadier than I felt. Same, Priya said, though hers wasn't. He looked at us for a long moment, something like grief in his eyes that I didn't understand yet. I've thought about that look many times since. I wish I'd taken it as the warning it was. Deanna, take the 2 on the right, he said. Priya, the 2 on the left. We took our positions, confused about why we'd be checking 2 bodies simultaneously and confused further by the missing equipment. Now, boss said. Take their pulses. What? I looked at him, certain I'd misheard. Please, just do it, then come sit with me. I checked the first body, a woman who looked to be in her 40s. The cold of her skin against my fingers made me shiver despite years of training that should have desensitized me to it. Nothing. No pulse. I exhaled, relieved in a way I hadn't expected to be. The second body was a man whose wrists had been too damaged to check, so I pressed my fingers into his neck instead. For one impossible half-second, I thought I felt something. A pulse. I pulled back immediately, telling myself it was my own heartbeat I'd felt. Nothing more. Vos watched me with an expression I couldn't read and gestured. For me to check again. I did. Nothing. I laughed quietly at my own paranoia and moved to sit beside him with Priya. Have you heard the story of how Jesus rose 3 days after his crucifixion? Vos asked without preamble. Neither of us answered. I'm sorry. I've never had to explain this to anyone before, he said. Priya and I exchanged a glance. I remember genuinely wondering if he'd lost his mind and whether we should leave while we still could. Tonight will either be very quiet, Vos said, or very eventful. Let's hope for quiet. Hours passed. I scrolled through my phone to stay awake. Priya made a second pot of coffee. When I reached for my headphones, Vos stopped me before I could put them in. Then came a sound, a groan, low and wet, from somewhere among the bodies in front of us. Vos's eyes darted between the 4 corpses. I felt my pulse hammering in my throat, and then another groan. He reached beneath his chair into a bag none of us had noticed and handed each of us a blade, keeping one for himself. Why do we need? Priya started. The man whose neck I'd checked earlier was sitting upright. His eyes were open, staring, though not at us, at something past us, something none of us could see. I'd seen this look once before on my grandfather. My legs nearly gave out beneath me. You two, put him down, Vos ordered, through the heart. I'm not killing him, I said. He's alive, Priya sobbed. He isn't. Not the way you mean it, Vos said, his own composure fraying. Put him to rest, now. I don't fully understand why I trusted him in that moment, but I found myself walking toward the man. As I got close, he turned his head and gave me the faintest smile before his gaze drifted back to whatever he'd been staring at. Priya tried to approach but was overtaken by nausea and ran for the nearest trash bin. In the 2 years I'd known her, I'd never once seen her flinch at a body, no matter how bad the condition. My hands shook as I positioned the blade over his heart. I forced down my own nausea and pressed forward. The moment his skin broke, he turned toward me with impossible speed and seized my arm. I screamed, trying to wrench free as his expression twisted into something furious, teeth bared, lunging toward my forearm. I shoved his head back with my free hand. Vos and Priya rushed to me. Priya pulled at my captured arm while I begged the thing in front of me to let go. Somehow, in the chaos of tangled limbs, Vos found an opening and drove his own blade through the man's chest. His grip released. He slumped backward onto the gurney, and the room went quiet except for our breathing. I'm sorry you had to go through that, Vos said, visibly shaken himself. There was no way to explain it that you would have believed. After that night, I stayed. I don't fully know why, except that alongside the fear, there was a curiosity I couldn't shake. Vos explained that some bodies return on the 3rd day after death. If there was any truth to the story of a man who rose after 3 days 2,000 years ago, he said, this might be the explanation behind it. Some came back peaceful. Others came back violent. None of them came back as the person they'd been in life. The job, he told us, wasn't really about preparing bodies for grieving families. It was about making sure the dead stayed dead. Embalming and refrigeration weren't just preservation methods. They were containment. We were both given a choice that night: stay or leave with help finding another career, and never speak a word of what we'd seen to anyone outside those walls. Priya and I both chose to stay. Voss took his own life a few years later. I don't think the weight of that secret was something a person could carry forever. Priya was killed by the husband of a woman whose body she'd been responsible for. A woman who apparently came back and was dealt with, and whose husband never forgave any of us for it. I left the profession not long after, but I still carry what I learned in that prep room. And I've spent every year since making sure the people I loved and the people I didn't know stayed exactly where they were laid to rest. Do with this information what you want, but I'll leave you with the same warning Voss gave me before he ever explained a single word of it. Let the dead stay dead. I've embalmed over 400 bodies in my career, and there are only 3 I've never been able to stop thinking about. I need to explain something about embalming first, because most people misunderstand what it actually does. It doesn't preserve a person forever. It slows decomposition, buys time for a viewing, gives a family a few days to say goodbye to something that still looks like their loved one. That's all it's supposed to do. I worked for a small, family-run funeral home outside of Tulsa, run by a woman named Marguerite Holt, who had inherited the business from her father, and I'd learn later, inherited something else from him too. Marguerite trained me herself for the first 6 months. She was meticulous in a way that bordered on ritual, insisting on exact measurements of embalming fluid, exact timing between steps, exact placement of instruments on the tray. I assumed it was just old-school precision. I didn't understand until much later that precision was the only thing standing between us and something none of us wanted to think about. The first case that changed how I saw this job was a man named Curtis Renner, brought in after a workplace accident. Standard case, nothing unusual about the body itself. What was unusual was Marguerite's instructions. Double the formaldehyde ratio, she told me. And don't rush the nick. I asked why. She said some bodies need more attention than others and left it at that. I didn't think much of it until I was alone in the prep room that night, finishing the final stitches, and Curtis Renner's hand twitched. I want to be clear that I know rigor mortis can cause involuntary movement. I know tendons contract, muscles spasm, gases shift inside a body in ways that look alarming to someone who's never seen it before. I told myself that's exactly what this was. Then his fingers curled slowly around the edge of the table. I called Marguerite immediately. She arrived within minutes, still in her nightgown, completely unsurprised. She didn't call anyone else. She didn't seem afraid. She simply walked to a locked cabinet in the corner of the prep room I'd never seen opened, retrieved a syringe filled with something I didn't recognize, and injected it directly into the base of his skull. His hand went still. "What was that?" I asked, my voice not quite steady. "Something the embalming fluid alone doesn't finish," she said. Some of them don't fully leave. Not right away. Sometimes not for days. This just helps them along." I asked her what she meant by "doesn't fully leave." She wouldn't elaborate that night, and for weeks afterward I told myself I'd imagined the whole thing. Exhaustion playing tricks on a mind that had spent too many hours around the dead. Then came Eleanor Voss, an elderly woman who died peacefully in her sleep, or so the family believed. Marguerite gave me the same instructions. Double ratio. Don't rush the nick. This time, I understood enough to be afraid before anything happened. Around 2 in the morning, I heard Eleanor's chest make a sound, not a groan. A word. I couldn't make it out clearly, just a fragment of syllables, wet and broken, like a voice trying to remember how language worked. I froze completely, unable to move toward her or away from her. Marguerite arrived within the minute, as though she'd been waiting for exactly this, and administered the same injection into the base of Eleanor's skull. Afterward, sitting in her office with 2 cups of tea neither of us touched, Marguerite finally explained what she'd never told anyone outside the family business. She said some people don't die all at once. She said consciousness, whatever it actually is, doesn't always leave a body cleanly the moment the heart stops. Sometimes it lingers, trapped, aware in some limited capacity of the body it's still inside, unable to fully let go and unable to properly return. The embalming process, done correctly with the right additive, helps that lingering awareness finally release. Done incorrectly or left completely alone, it can remain sometimes for days, aware in the dark of a casket, unable to move, unable to scream, simply waiting. "You're saying they're conscious?" I said. "In the casket. After we've prepared them? Only some. Only for a little while," she said. The injection ends it quickly. Painlessly, we believe. It's a mercy, not a violation. I asked her how long this had been happening. She told me her father had discovered it decades earlier, completely by accident, and had spent the rest of his career refining the process quietly, rather than expose families to something that would only compound their grief with horror. She said every funeral home that's been in business long enough eventually learns this truth, and every one of them keeps it exactly as quiet as we did. I wanted to quit that night. I nearly did. But there was a detail Marguerite mentioned, almost as an afterthought, that kept me in that building for another 3 years. She said the additive doesn't always work. Sometimes, for reasons she'd never determined, a small percentage of bodies don't respond to it at all. The lingering awareness simply continues, sealed inside a casket, inside a grave, for as long as the body itself takes to fully decompose. Years. Sometimes longer. If the casket is well sealed, I asked her how she lived with that knowledge. She told me the only thing anyone in this profession can do is minimize how often it happens, and never, under any circumstances, let a family know. The third case, the one I still think about most nights, was a young man named Peter Dell, 26 years old, dead from a car accident on the interstate. Marguerite wasn't there that night. I was alone, following her instructions from memory, careful with the ratio, careful with the neck. The additive didn't work. I didn't realize it hadn't worked until 3 days after the funeral, when Peter's mother called the funeral home in tears, saying she'd had a dream so vivid and horrible she couldn't function. A dream where her son was screaming from somewhere underground, begging someone to let him out, to please let him out. I told her it was grief. I told her dreams like that are common, that the mind does terrible things when it's trying to process loss. She believed me, or wanted to badly enough to pretend she did. I've never told anyone what I actually did that night, 3 days after her call. I drove to the cemetery alone, brought the tools I needed, and did something no mortician is ever supposed to do to a body that's already been laid to rest. I won't describe what I found when I opened that casket. I won't describe the sound that came out of it, or the state Peter Dahl was in after 3 days sealed in the dark, aware, unable to move, unable to scream in any way the world above could hear. I administered the injection myself, hands shaking so badly I nearly missed the base of his skull twice. When it finally stopped, I sat beside that open grave until the sun came up. And I have never, in the years since, been able to fully explain to myself why I did what I did that night, instead of simply walking away and letting it end on its own. I left the profession not long after. Marguerite still runs that funeral home as far as I know. I don't know how many bodies have passed through her hands since I left, or how many of them received the mercy the rest of us never got to give. I think about Peter Dahl more than any of the others. I think about how long he was aware down there before I arrived. I think about every funeral I attended before I understood any of this. Every casket I once assumed held nothing but stillness. I don't attend funerals anymore. I can't sit in a room with a closed casket without wondering every single time whether the person inside is actually at rest or whether they're simply waiting. in the only way they still can, for someone to finally let them go. I've been a funeral director for almost 15 years, and most of what I do is paperwork. People don't expect that. They imagine embalming, makeup, caskets, but the truth is, at least half this job is documentation. Death certificates, cause of death forms, chain of custody logs. Every body that comes through our doors generates a file, and every file has to match the body exactly. Name, date of death, cause, next of kin. This is a story about a file that didn't match. I work at a mid-size funeral home in a town in Ohio I won't name. Mostly because the family involved still lives there and deserves whatever privacy I can still give them. We handle maybe 6 or 7 cases a week, nothing unusual for a place our size. My assistant director, a quiet, careful man named Gerald Amos, has worked here even longer than I have, and he's the one who first noticed the discrepancy. A woman named Louise Kirshner had passed away at home, natural causes, 81 years old. Her family requested a standard viewing, closed casket per her wishes. Nothing unusual about the arrangement at all. Gerald pulled her file to process the paperwork the way he always does, cross-referencing the hospital's cause of death report with our internal intake form. He came to my office holding both documents, looking more unsettled than I'd seen him in years. "The dates don't match," he said. I asked him what he meant. He showed me. The hospital's official time of death, signed and stamped, read 4:12 in the morning. Our own intake paperwork, filled out by the paramedics who transported her to us, listed the time we received the body as 3:45. That same morning, we had received Louise Kirshner's body, 14 minutes before the hospital had recorded her as dead. Told Gerald it was probably a clerical error, a mistyped digit, the kind of small mistake that happens constantly in an industry that runs on tired night shift workers filling out identical forms 100 times a week. He agreed, mostly, but asked if I'd call the hospital just to confirm. I did. The records department took 2 days to get back to me, and when they did, they apologized and said there'd been an internal review. The time of death had been reconfirmed as accurate, 4:12 in the morning. They had no explanation for the discrepancy with our intake form and suggested it was likely an error on our end. I might have let it go there, except Gerald kept the 2 forms pinned side by side on the corkboard in his office for weeks afterward. And every time I passed it, something about it nagged at me in a way I couldn't quite name. 3 months later, it happened again. A man named Robert Aldis, 64, died of a heart attack in his home. Same pattern. Hospital paperwork listed the official time of death. Our intake form, filled out independently by a different transport team entirely, listed the body's arrival at our facility 11 minutes before that official time. I called the hospital again. Same response. A review confirmed that time was accurate. No explanation for the gap. I started paying closer attention after that, and once I knew to look for it, I found 6 more cases over the following year, scattered across different hospitals in our county, different transport teams, different causes of death entirely, all sharing one detail in common. In every single case, our intake form recorded the body arriving at our funeral home somewhere between 8 and 20 minutes before the hospital's official time of death. I brought this to Gerald privately, not wanting anyone else on staff involved until we understood what we were looking at. He'd noticed the same pattern independently and had started quietly compiling his own list. Dates and times written in a small notebook he kept in his desk drawer. Something he admitted he hadn't told me about because he wasn't sure how to explain why it mattered so much to him. "It's not a paperwork error," he finally said. "Paperwork errors aren't this consistent, and they're not always in the same direction." I asked him what he thought was actually happening. He didn't have an answer. Neither did I. But we started noticing something else once we looked closely enough. In every one of these 8 cases, the body had shown a specific, minor characteristic during embalming preparation that we hadn't thought to connect before. A faint localized warmth in the chest cavity, gone within the first hour of intake, subtle enough that neither of us had flagged it as unusual at the time, assuming it was simply residual body heat from a recent death. Nothing more. Except recent deaths don't retain warmth selectively in one specific area, while the rest of the body has already begun cooling normally, the way all 8 of these bodies had. I don't have an explanation for what this means. And after 4 years of watching for it, neither does Gerald. We've never told the families involved because there's genuinely nothing actionable to tell them. We've never told the hospital because the one time we raised it directly, they treated it as an accusation of clerical incompetence and nothing more. What I can tell you is that Gerald retired last year, and before he left, he gave me his notebook. 8 cases over 4 years had become 19 cases over 11 years by the time he handed it to me, each one following the same pattern almost precisely. I've kept adding to it since he left. 3 more cases in the past 8 months alone, more frequent than the years before it. I don't know if that means something is changing, or if I'm simply paying closer attention now than I ever did before Gerald first noticed it. What unsettles me most isn't the missing minutes themselves. Plenty of clerical explanations could account for a handful of mistimed reports across more than a decade, if I'm being fair about it. What unsettles me is the warmth, because in every single case, it's localized to the same place, the center of the chest, and it always fades within roughly the same window of time after the body arrives here, as though something inside each of them takes almost exactly 1 hour to finish leaving. I don't know what happens in those minutes between when we receive a body and when the hospital says it officially died. I don't know if the hospital's clock is wrong or ours is, or if something entirely different is happening that neither piece of paperwork was ever designed to capture. I just know I've started checking every intake form the moment a body arrives, before anyone touches it, before anything else happens in that room. And more than once now, standing there with a stopwatch I've started keeping in my coat pocket. I've watched the exact center of a newly arrived chest, and I swear I've seen it rise, just once, just barely, long after every machine in that room has already told me there's nothing left to rise at all.